Now, I would like to welcome you to the second part of this day. And I would like to try to provide a transition to what we heard before in the introduction. Because we should bear in mind that Carlton Wurstler is the editor-in-chief of Textdorf Kunst. So actually this is a professional and independent digital platform which was created by the new media. And now, so to speak, we would like to have a look at a different trend resulting from this that is called judgment versus expert judgment. So that, as a matter of principle, the social media have raised the producers and the critics to a different type of input. And we may wonder whether this is a democratization of art and what makes it different from populism and what is the position of scholars. Or is populism part of democracy or its opposite? And Imran Kurt, the editor-in-chief of Monopoly since 2016, but she worked for it before. Before she wrote articles in the art section of Frankfurter Rundschau and in other print media, and also a radio essayist and feature author. And she will chair the discussion. And now, when I prepared this day, it again occurred to me that, for instance, she wrote articles about the matriarchal pop revolution, or now on the occasion of the Art Colonia, that is the award issued to Mildred Bright. She has always considered and discussed about these problems, because we just had the question, what is art criticism in terms of the documenta, and she always placed the focus on the content of art and the context in which it is exhibited and how it is installed. And recently she had a very interesting and controversial discussion with Robert Ulrich, and I'm looking forward to the next round. Thank you very much indeed for being here as a chairwoman. I'm looking forward to this very exciting panel about crowd judgment versus expert judgment. And right away I would like to briefly introduce the panel to you, those sitting here. That is on your far left, Wolfgang Ulrich, a historian of art living in Leipzig, and is one of the most renowned authors of art theory. And he's always willing to explain phenomena of the present, for instance, the liaison of power and art, or how selfies can be categorized in terms of the history of art. Only one of the many things he has written about. And at Wagenbach, together with Katrin Kurroth, he is the editor of a series of books about the digital picture or image culture. We are very happy to have you. Then Julia Grosse. She's also an art critic, author, and co-founder of the platform Contemporary Ant, dealing with art from Africa or the African diaspora, and she is a lecturer at the University of Sciences in of Arts in Berlin, and she's also a member of the Gropius organization. Next to me, Christian Demann. He's a journalist and musician, which is very interesting, but probably in the first place he's a philosopher, and he wrote his themes about shame on the Philistines, was about art criticism. And so I read this thesis very intensively, and I learned a lot about my own self-image. And since 2012 he's been the editor of the traditional culture journal Mercure. So legacy media as such, that is almost exclusively legacy media, if we want to categorize it according to the prior speakers. We are going to talk about about criticism as it is now, that is expert judgment versus crowd judgment. And perhaps I should start as follows. That is, perhaps we should again try to remember what in the first place we needed experts for, and this relationship, which may now being eroded by the social media, that is, how did this system work? And I would first like to ask this question of Christian Demann. Now then, I will try to be brief. Yes, absolutely. Well, in the prior presentation, we could see a large image picture showing an exhibition back from 1785, I think, with lots of paintings, that is hundreds and hundreds of paintings from the floor to the ceiling in huge rooms. And it actually very much resembled the last pictures, the last depictions, which were meant to illustrate the current complex situation. And well, I could see that even at that time it was so complex that critics had to try to differentiate it because of this huge offer, and they had to find a common point for a public discussion. So questions, providing questions on the basis of which such a discussion can start, on which it can be continued. And well, we had to reduce the complexity to do this. And what is so interesting about this is that this already existed then, according to the French Academy of Arts. Artists themselves felt that they knew much more about this than ever a critic, male critic. That time there were no female critics, I'm afraid. And this is how criticism started, how it began as a phenomena when people, amateurs, and in the view of experts, became involved in the academy. That is, they assumed the right to be critics and they wanted to pass judgment. And as far as these framework conditions are concerned, well, they haven't changed very much up to now, even if the conditions in public are now completely different. So, critic as a sort of entitlement or arrogance. So, often they thought it was very aspirational. And the question arose whether we really need criticism, or we could assume that people were in agreement on what the purpose of art was, and this agreement existed for a while in the form of a large institution, that is the Academy of the Visual Arts in Paris. And it had also a very beneficial arrangement, that is, it actually provided the only public exhibitions. And at that time, when somebody stood up and said, "No, I do not believe that with your hierarchy, that is, with your judgments, you are right. No, I claim that I can also pass judgment." And maybe the hour of birth of art criticism, and well, that was the basic situation, the original situation on the basis of which criticism arose. Julia, why do we need experts in criticism? Well, I think I can continue this idea, this train of thought. Because we're talking about the crowd, perhaps we should first define what the crowd is. No, the crowd as critics, as a sort of new phenomenon, also within the context of social media and so forth. So, actually, this is not quite correct, because the crowd in the past, or also in the remote past, played a certain role. For instance, l'Exposition des Refusés in Paris in 1867, that is, where it was the crowd which provided a legitimation for a devastating critique. And people were standing in front of Manet and the then strange painters, and they laughed their heads off. And this laughing as a sign of power, laughing at art at that time, that was seen as a sort of legitimization for a very negative judgment about these works of art. And I had a look at this, actually, I studied this. That is as scorching reviews in the history of art. that is the public, that is the majority of society, had a voice then, not as today. But anyway, at that time, the basic attitude, the non-understanding of the avant-garde art at that time. And that was a component of the time. And actually, I think that was quite interesting, very exciting. And in this post-war period of the history of art, the audience had sort of disappeared. And you always thought that the critic is just having a discussion with the oeuvre or the piece of art. And so in this respect, we can say that people always played a role. And I would make another difference, another differentiation, because it's a somewhat bold hypothesis. But the majority, or let's rather say many people, judge it's good or bad. And a critic wants to try and interpret a work of art, or wants to go more into depth, which the crowd is not interested in. The crowd will just say, I like it or I do not like it. Perhaps you could discuss about that, what your view of this is. So your hypothesis is that the crowd wants to pass judgment, but critics will first want to interpret and explain. And they tend towards this. And it's not about an interpretation or the interpreting authority, but I understand what I'm seeing. And this may not be so when crowds go to exhibition. Well, there aren't any crowds anyway, but I think they do not try to understand it. They just say, I like it or I do not like it. It's still so today, nowadays. And you can also apply this to other things, films and so on. When we say whether a crowd, it says so here in the title, crowd and the individual expert. I mean, what are the intersections here? And these are your popular media films, or the new Beyoncé album, which is also reviewed in the culture section of a paper where an expert writes about it. So I would say that everybody has a somewhat different angle of the work of art. And this may again then rescue art criticism, because the interpretation is what the crowd is not really interested in. We will actually rescue art criticism only at the very end. And first, we are still pessimistic in terms of culture. Wolfgang Ullrich. What did we need the expert for at that time, when we still needed expert? What is this personality? Well, or this sort of expertise, this art criticism, I mean, it was developed when the modern art system developed with the museums, exhibitions, the exhibition system. I mean, exhibitions have just been mentioned, and all these are or were institutions which also were based on a notion of highbrow culture. When people only wanted to show the very best, they argued about quantity, but also they tried to find limits, borders. That is what they had to exclude. That is what they do not allow in exhibition, and the scarcest resource has always been visibility. And what is now happening in the institutions, or what happened then, was actually again supported, accompanied, legitimized by art criticism, to again provide the arguments why one work of art should be in and another one not. And I believe we cannot see this role of art criticism without this institutional context in which it came about and where it played a role. And when we look at this history, these historical aspects, then we become aware of the upheavals which are taking place now. There have always been attempts to provide more visibility, to expand visibility, this scarce resource, when we think of the 19th century art associations, because at that time they were against the establishment, the social establishment. They were not necessarily a judgment of the crowd, but not necessarily a judgment of experts, but rather a general public who were interested in art. They also wanted to express their views. They want to put forward their interests. So perhaps this was an initial attempt to create a broader public, to provide more visibility. And I think this is also related to what we heard before. I think that only now, with the establishment of the social media, has something fundamentally changed. Visibility is no longer a scarce resource. However, as we must add, visibility does not necessarily follow the logic of the institutions of highbrow culture or of art criticism, but it will now follow the algorithms of the platform. And what applies here is, for instance, where people who have more followers are held in higher esteem, so to speak. And now there are completely different criteria which get involved. And these are the criteria which we know from areas of the pop culture, even before the social media. That is, we had charts at that time, which was about the sales figures of a piece of music, and it wasn't because some music critic said it's the best song of the year, or in literature. We have always had the bestseller lists. And in addition to all the literary criticism, the culture sections of newspapers, and now there is an upheaval in visual arts, and that's very interesting because visual arts has been the area where there has only been something like high culture, highbrow culture, unlike in literature and music. And this has made the social media all the more powerful in this respect, in this field. When you look at the art market, you can already observe how things are changing drastically, and completely new markets are coming about, new segments. But to some extent, the same platforms, the same places which were established, well, or perhaps in a couple of years' time, as we can buy hermetic poetry and also cheap novels, penny novels there. In a bookshop, we might also see concept art in a gallery, but also something with which has 1 million followers. I have already seen this, but I will not tell you the name of the gallery. This might be a precursor of a development which is now starting, and that is the moment where we are now. And art criticism and other institutions are being faced with the question whether we should nevertheless try to maintain such a highbrow excluding status, perhaps as a response to this, or should we fully accept this to say, well, high and low art has always been a distinction and now we can get rid of it, or how should we respond to that? That is the question now. So you mean a sort of synchronicity? Yeah, synchronicity, simultaneity. Yeah, it's what is also different in visual arts from culture is because it implies questions of how the institutions can deal with this new challenge. And without changing profoundly, can they do this? Can they follow suit? Because it would mean that they must now first buy a lot to show a lot. But this is not based on a large volume, on mass, but it's the collection system that is to keep the best. However unreal it may have been, or how idealistic it may have been, but the claim, the ambition was we will take only the very best, and that's worthwhile doing it. And then we can also allocate a huge budget for this. And if this basic principle isn't working anymore, then much more will change in the art industry than in literature, where we have always had this system. Yeah, and museums must always prove their raison d'être. And irrespective of social media, the ambition has grown to increase the number of visitors. And now all of a sudden you can do this quite easily. You just have to put Banksy in the museum or an art toy exhibition, and then you will get the large volume of visitors you didn't have before. Then you have good figures without offering a conveyance of art, because this will happen as a matter of course. So we are trying to take this up, but new processes are coming about. It doesn't mean that all museums, all institutions must find the same responses to this. It would be a pity if all the responses were the same. So this is another opportunity of differentiation when some museums are saying, now we see ourselves as a forum for popular art, and others may be saying, no, if they do it, we will only show the very complex works of art requiring a lot of education, but they might then lose their audience. Now, the art industry is very interesting because of the question of who defines what is important in art or not. We have long had the feeling that it's not necessarily critics, and this is not necessarily the narcissistic approach of the social media, but you have this special position in art, in the art system, because the canon, the institutionalization, the museums exist, and on the other hand, there are the market and the collectors and the audience, that is the many, the crowd, but the collectors are the few. So to speak, from two sides, there are different influences on the canon, because what the few collectors buy will go up in value, but what the many want to see might also go up in value. So how will this constellation change, and was the position of the critic in this, or which role made it assume in this field of tension? Oh, there is a third factor which may gain importance between the few collectors and the hopefully or presumably many more visitors, because there are also the followers. And these are not only people who assign likes or who post something, but they may also want to get more from the artist they're following. So there are completely new types of artifact which are gaining popularity, which might have been called a multiple or an edition before. This now exists in many variants and beyond the official art market. And this is also sort of crowd judgment. It may not be the right expression, but judgment of a great many people who also make buying decisions. And then perhaps they buy something from a superstar artist, and they want an unlimited edition than something else, a smaller piece of artwork of art from an unknown artist from whom you would get the original. So there might be many changes here in the entire art market. And we must think about whether we should not take some remedial action here. I think we haven't observed this enough yet. That is what has been happening over the past 2 years. And new structures are also becoming established clandestinely, surreptitiously. And so we must first observe the situation in the art market. And so a critic must also be a sort of sociologist to describe what's happening. And only then can we think about how we should respond, who should respond to this, and what are the different modes of response. I would like to come back to the synchronicity, because I believe it's key to that. And art criticism, yeah, that is, we have to classify this. But I had been wondering whether what we are talking about is perhaps very German. Because when you go to the Barbican Centre in London, it's precisely this. That is, in the front yard you find some food trucks with Jamaican food, then you must get through there, through the crowd, and then there might be some children workshops in the anteroom. Behind this there is a cinema with a Viking blockbuster film, which you do not want to watch. And then there is an exhibition about masculinity, but actually you want to gain Panther de Brahms concert at the very rear, but you have to go through so many different groups and to come to terms with people who want to watch a Viking film. So the question is whether this is still a museum or rather a house of culture, a culture house, or would it have to do this specifically anyway? So I think it's this synchronicity of a house, of a place, but also the other houses you find in a city like London. And by the way, even very specific houses, museums like the National Portrait Gallery, try to provide a very accessible program to address, to engage the public at large. So I think we can learn a lot from them, that is from the Brits in this respect. But you were going to say something. Now perhaps we should add that that is what I call the original scene. That is that there is a lot happening in the silence, and we have to classify this. And the museum might be one institutional answer to this. And we must see whether we will have many more critical duties, because when we critics are hearing, I think that that we are just reviewers. Somebody goes to an exhibition, says it's good or bad, and I saw this painting. Unfortunately, it's only middle of the road, mediocre. But art criticism in this overall framework, which was defined with the museums, means much more. It means a theory of art, a theory of science of perception, a measuring of the cultural world, and the importance of art as such in terms of amateurship, sensuality, and so on. So I do not believe that, that the framework conditions will not be adversely affected by this new development. And there will continue to be demand for all this, because the more complex the present will be and the cultural phenomena, the bigger the demand will be for people who can offer an interpretation and explanation, so that people can navigate through this. You're being very optimistic, aren't you? Well, I work for a magazine which does this for many walks of life, not only art. And we have a small readership, relatively small, because we are a legacy medium. But it still exists. So it was established in 1947, and it still exists. So this demonstrates that there is a demand for this, a need for this, not only to review something, because we hardly ever do this, but to allow people to explain things in more detail. And I think that this duty will become more important, not less important. Based on my experience, I can say that this review feuilleton, this review section in Monopoly, well, we don't have a high circulation. People are not interested in this, but it's always been like this. The culture section was filled with reviews, but at that time we were not able to check this empirically, and nobody wanted to know who read this, the reviews. That is, what art critics did may always have been something for a very small group only, and the large crowd, which allegedly is taken over now, wasn't interested in this. Oh, I don't know about the others, but my impression is that the critic who passes judgment and who has an influence on something, that this was much stronger in a regional context where you had only one or two magazines. And the public is, all in all, is more restricted, and this is not necessarily a new phenomenon which we are dealing with, but we talked about the power of social media, and there have long been instances which assume this role which you are demanding, and which was also mentioned in the presentation as a paradigm, that is a recommendation as a sort of duty of art criticism. These are now the influencers on the social media who fulfill this role. And sometimes they do it with a certain level of responsibility and on experimental basis. That is, and they may also draw the attention to an exhibition by means of a posting. It might be in captures or on TikTok, the way a video is posted, a video from this exhibition, that is how it's cut and how music is added. And these are still very experimental and preliminary formats, I'd say, but nevertheless this is a contemporary format and above all a future format of art criticism, what we've got there. So these are completely new formats, but also they are appropriate. That is, they reflect the interest in art on the social media.
But the hypothesis was that this environment is toxic and there is no art criticism that within the logics of the algorithms can take place. And you would counter-argue that, right? Well, it might be too naive and too optimistic if I simply argue against it. Nonetheless, when I sort of observe it myself and see what is happening, then I discover again and again things that I do find interesting and things that I think would make sense. I don't know in every individual case what would be cancelled or pushed by algorithms, but that it's not a good direction per se, well, I wouldn't say that. What I think is that there is a sort of fear regarding the synchronicity when more voices are raised. What will be art? What is good art at the end of the day? Because this term art is sort of very stretched in the sense of, okay, if certain influencers, for example, say, okay, this is great, this is really important, and the traditional art critics sort of really disagree. That will be interesting to see whether or what tolerance is there regarding the term art and to live with that as well. And, talking about the UK, I think it's great that they manage to not always emphasize the high versus low culture, because they included pop culture in a very early stage. So there it's sort of normal. I think about 1,000 years ago, I organized a documentary on impoverished aristocracy, and I went to visit them. And yes, they spent the whole day riding their horses, and in the evening they watched Britain's Got Talent. And I thought that's exactly what it's about. You have these people with their long names, 10 names, but at the end of the day, they sit there in their pajamas and watch the same TV that all of us watch. I think that's really where we have to get to not say, okay, this is good and this is bad. No, everything exists. And regarding the synchronicity, when I read news apps, I tend to always read the comments as well. So I don't look from the two things at the two things as separate. So for me, at least if there's a good moderator, I think it's great to see it, even though it's not representative, but it's interesting to find out what people think about certain topics. And I think if the technology gets better in that field in the future, then that is a sort of synchronicity where you can read both things at the same time. The text, and it can be political as well, the criticism and the simultaneous criticism. When you talked about synchronicity, so you can show both sides. And for me, that's something that I've really internalized, that I am reading the comments as well as the article. And sometimes they're great. This didn't exist before, and I think it's really enriching, apart from, the trolls and everything that goes wrong. I think that in the arts industry, the struggle is particularly difficult because we mentioned it. It's about gatekeeping. It's about deciding what art is and what isn't art. Since the beginning of the avant-garde, we've been arguing about the term art. What does art include? The question is, why is it important? Because it's an economic factor. Because the real art is supposed to be eternal, while as other things aren't art and are thrown away. And that is why I think it's so difficult. That's what makes people aggressive. When it started with Clubhouse, I think all of us forgot about Clubhouse, but there was a time when all of us met on Clubhouse. And I heard so many people talk that I'd never heard before, and this aggressiveness towards gatekeeping, this frustration, people thinking, why are experts telling me what art is? I want this beautiful, colorful picture to be art, and I'm not interested in knowing why you don't think it's art. This is important. The question is, what do we lose if we open up towards that? If we say, okay, now everything that you want to be art will be art. That's fine. So then you maybe don't go to the Art Basel, but you go to the shop next door and say you buy art there. Why do we lose? Why does it hurt? Are we losing anything? Is it simply that we're snobs? I think it's our fear of being destroyed. I think nothing will happen. And that's what I mean when I talk about interpretation and judgment. There will nonetheless be differences within this synchronicity, not on a hierarchical level, but in the way how we observe it. And then it might not be about convincing the crowd of, I don't know, saying that Manet and Frida Kahlo are the most important artists of the universe. So we need to be more tolerant and we need to learn how to respect other things without saying that everything is equal. No, but more tolerance. And I mean, that's a huge topic, but a tolerance in the context of opinion, an opinion or a taste. I don't even know what to call it, but to say we agree to disagree. I might never like Jeff Koons. Oh, that's a bad example. Oh, now it'll get tricky, but something maybe even more profane, something that I'll say I'll never like it. But nonetheless, I have to respect the fact that for a certain perspective or for certain people, it is art. I don't think that destroys the term art. So I'm confident, I'm optimistic. What do you say? Christian Demand, in your book really dealt with snobism of critics. You know, people who want to be important. It's terrible, isn't it? Well, it was mainly about, and I probably wouldn't have written the book if I would have known back then how many people are already aware of what I'm writing about. For me, it was mainly about the language of art, a very similar, a very strange rhetoric way of pretending to know all the expertise while as hiding the fact that there is no expertise on that case. And I would want to keep up on that for the following conversations, because I think that is still very much a present topic. Very often we tend to say, okay, the experts do not have the same weight as before, but what sort of experts do we have when it's not about, and that's maybe what we mean by talking about avant-garde, plural, when that is starting to get more differentiated. You can be a football expert, and that doesn't mean that you talk in a unanimous way. That's also a fiction, but there is a certain set of rules, and within that framework, you can really calculate the use and the costs of a certain field. So you can, for example, say, okay, that player is super fast and he's really good. So there's a certain expertise that you simply have to accept. But when it comes to the question of, well, shouldn't they maybe wear hats? That's when it gets tricky. And I would say the art business, the arts industry, showed how one type of sports can turn into many. You can again and again say, okay, this picture is not very contemporary anymore, but now it's about hiding. It's about not exhibiting anymore. How are we going to have expertise for tomorrow's way of doing art? That's, I think, where the problem starts. And that is why I don't think that a canon expertise exists. It has never existed, at least not in the past centuries. And that is why again called it the need to comment. That is why many of these performances, pieces of art, are constantly accompanied by explanations. And that was basically the focus of my book. The fact that they have to exist and the fact that they become even more important the bigger the field that we move in and the more diverse the things that happen there are. I think that we should take that as a given. Boris Kreuz once said that a criticism is somebody who points something out. And that brings us back to influencers, right? Very simple job. But getting back to what you said regarding the question, okay, what is art actually? Experts tend to or try to answer that question. And I would once again question whether that will be the relevant question in the future, whether that question doesn't stem from this high cultural era. And even just saying the art, singular, whether in the future it might actually be a phenomenon that, yes, on the one hand, has the ambition to play a role in the art world, but to maybe not restrict themselves to that. They might also have a political ambition or a representative ambition. And that would mean that the same object can maybe play a role in different fields. So then it's not just an object of art criticism, but also of other instances that might pass very different judgments regarding whether they think this project, this artifact, this piece of art is good or not. And that is why I think that will bring us to very different fundamental questions. And this, of course, leads to this whole logics of gatekeeping simply isn't appropriate anymore. And yes, this can be frustrating to some, can also mean more work, more effort, because we have to start rethinking things and becoming more open-minded, maybe even be accepting that the fact that others want to join the debate, even though they might have other reasons to judge or to review something. But that question, I think, isn't what is important for most of those who play a role as players nowadays. The question, what is art, and what differs art from non-art? And I think we can also start by saying, okay, I'm lacking the terminology to write about that topic, even though I'm an expert, but when it's about global art, this can almost feel a bit offending when we don't have the tools to talk about some topics, and we still haven't found a solution for that. There are still difficulties in that field when it comes to describing positions that we can contextualize because they are not part of our own artistic or cultural socialization. So I think we do have some practice in that field when it comes to redefining the tools that we need. Also, what you said when you talked about that nobody knows what types of arts will exist in 50 years. And we might need a new language to talk about that, new tools, because there will be a new generation of writers, of people who can deal with that. I think art criticism grows with the change of art production. Because, like I said, I probably write very differently from somebody who's 25 about contemporary art, because I grew up in a different way. Somebody who's 25 now grew up with social media, so I think that already has an impact. I think that really not letting go this topic of the limitations between art and non-art, that's a very Western thing. One of my favorite pieces of the documenta was of Richard Barr, the pissoir in the basement with some balloons, and that was called Western art. And it was so obvious that he wanted to say, okay, you can keep the next 100 years talk about whether a pissoir is art or not. It's not interesting to us. We have more important things to talk about. And I really enjoyed that artwork because it showed one thing. It really told us to wake up and to remind ourselves that there are more important things to debate. But on the other hand, I do ask myself whether we in an expert position are even more needed, because we have to communicate this. We have to communicate what we talk about. This is something that can't be communicated in an Instagram post. But I think it was not that much about the vision that everything can only be posted via Instagram. Oh, yes. No, yes, of course. The synchronicity, once again. Both things. Well, I don't want to overestimate it, but we have 3,000 regular readers with very long articles. Then we do that no matter how many Instagram posts we post. We will they will remain interesting to us. They will still be valuable for us because we can assume that some of those who read our articles are at home in both worlds and even in more worlds than just the two of them. So I think there can be a coexistence between the two. And also when it comes to interpretation, I think it becomes even more important. More important, and also in some regard it might make things easier, because there were these complaints about, oh, why do we even need art criticism? It's all very random. There's no more criteria. What is left to do? Is it just a gesture of power because some person enjoys one thing or doesn't enjoy it? Because you could also look at it from a different perspective. And I think we have a return from criteria. And now there are so many things that are offered today in today's world that don't just play a role in the art world. So these things address dominant discourses, for example. Maybe we could make them in a more ecological way. Maybe it would have gotten better. So at some point, you have all these different dimensions as part of the discourse, and they can be applied to what we look at as art to decide not just whether it's interesting and new, but also because other aspects play a role today. And that is why I think those who understand themselves as critics have to try to also understand some of the new criteria and to pass judgment on them. And that's also a very interesting transition, I think. But when I observe myself, I do have to say that I find it sort of more satisfying than 10 or 15 years ago. I'm under the impression that I'm standing on firm ground when I pass my judgments now regarding a project that might not just play a role in the art world, but that also maybe plays an activist role, or maybe positions itself in a different way. We can then also look at that dimension and say, okay, does it fulfill its target? You know, like when we talked about football, we could say, you can basically measure whether something is happening due to this activist action or does it not happen. And it's a very different level, a very different dimension. But the judgment or the criticism that I pass, it's way more diverse than if I just follow the formal aesthetic dimensions. So are we going to assess art from different perspectives in the future? Well, that would be very stressful for the artists. Well, even just the fact that a few years ago it would have been unthinkable to have anyone think about whether an exhibition with artists from different countries deliver their artwork with an airplane. Back then we needed somebody to actually go there, take the artwork, and that person had to go on the plane in order to make sure that one artwork would reach the place where it would have to go. So back then that was normal. Now we discuss these topics, and this shows that we have really moved beyond this time where just our nationalist or a local criteria applies. Or if you look at an artwork, I looked at an artwork, for example, of an artist who works with concrete, and I looked at it and then I thought, okay, well, am I even allowed to look at that? Is that person actually still working with concrete? When did he do it? All these things make art more complicated because this catalog that we have, you know, that where you have to tick all the boxes, you know, what's the material and so on. But the autonomy of art, how many times did I hear about it this summer? This fear of losing autonomy. Do you not feel that? But it's so funny. He's shaking his head. Because we started with the avant-garde. I would just say in parentheses that we don't really know what art wants, what art is. Well, that's a phenomenon that actually started in the 18th century or even earlier than that. But never mind. Let's assume that that's the case. And then if we look at what we call historical avant-garde, those are usually positions that fought against autonomy. And when I remember correctly, it was bringing together art and life that was sort of the ideal situation after the experiences of the First World War, where millions of people died. All of a sudden, people said, okay, why don't we do something that is connected to what is happening in the world? So to pretend today that art autonomy is sort of a legacy, something that we have with us and that we have to maintain, well, I think that's historically quite problematic. I don't think that's the case. Well, that's astounding. Why do I read about that in the German feuilleton, in the culture feature? Probably invited the wrong people to the panel. Where are those who argue for art autonomy? Well, I actually agree. It's a difficult time because, okay, maybe a bit of a different topic, but when it comes about opening processes of museums, I think it is still very important that it's on the museums to make sure there's accessibility for the audience, for people from different places who get there, but it's not the job of the artists who exhibit their work there. They don't have to think about the audience. I think this is very important that we separate these two things, because otherwise I would think, okay, to be an artist in the future is terrible if you have to reflect on that whole catalog in the future, you know, to say, okay, for the application, I have to make sure that this is working out. I think that should be the job of art production. So that's a bit of a difficulty. I think it will become more complex. And yes, that's what I think is difficult regarding autonomy. What effect will it have on art production? Maybe to argue a bit for autonomy, I think it is important to mention that, of course, there is also the risk that only these criteria count, so that when you look at a piece of concrete that you think, okay, is this actually ecologically okay or not? And then you get to the result, well, it's not okay, and you end at that point. Then it is important to, because the aesthetic quality, you know, to think about that and to think, okay, maybe it was necessary to use concrete and it's justified because the results within that context of art is very convincing. So as a central pole of what art judgment will remain in the future, that I think is necessary. And there, I think there is reason for concern that this might disappear and that we don't talk about formal and aesthetic qualities anymore at all, that we just talk about the rest. So it's really always about looking at both sides, striking a balance, negotiating, and yes, bringing everything into our understanding. The old aesthetic criteria of balancing, I think, is also becoming more important, right? Well, I think it is interesting. The question is, of course, to get back to the topic of the Documenta, it's just about the experience, having been there, where I thought so often that on the one hand, we said again and again that we have to know more about what is being exhibited there. We have to explain a lot, communicate a lot. Nonetheless, I was under the impression that the experiences of the visitors was very direct. So that it's more this type of art not understanding itself as autonomous, but more of a community-related art, that it's way more accessible, that art critics do really struggle with classifying and understanding it, but the wider audience doesn't really have that much of a problem with it. And I don't know what your impression was, how you interpreted it, and what it means for art criticism. Well, that's exactly what I meant. As a visitor, from a visitor's perspective, it was a very accessible experience. So you didn't have to, content-wise, go into the theory, but there was an offer to participate in everything, to be a part of it. And that's where I thought it was, in part, well, I mean, there were, I think, about 5,000 articles were written about this from different perspectives. But I thought from an art criticism perspective, it was sort of lame that they said, well, this is simply not enough. Aesthetically, it's not well done. It looks like the final work of an art student. And that's when I thought, well, isn't there more potential? Can we not maybe, from a perspective of an expert, go more into it? That's what I didn't really understand it. Well, did you read any alternative articles? Was there a sort of criticism that didn't really follow the local criteria that much? Anything that was eye-opening? I didn't really read much about that. Many of the questions that were addressed there, I mean, there was so much, a lot of really good literature, but in this field, was there anything eye-opening? Well, was there the need to open any eyes? I mean, the interpretation, what do I see when people are in there and play checks? Is there any need for interpretation? I think the interpretation would be that art and community can take place. Well, but the interpretation, with the background that it's an institutionalized exhibition that takes itself very seriously, and yes, it did so rightly for a long time, but within a tradition, with expectations and in a funding structure, that it takes place in this context. There are so many questions that are needed to be interpreted. Even just the question whether it's worth watching two people play a game of checks. Was it worth it? But you're already in the midst of interpreting it or judging it. Yes, but I think these questions are relevant. On the one hand, we say, okay, it's not the question whether something is art or not, but of course one should be able to ask whether it's worth the effort, whether this couldn't have been organized in a more accessible way. People wouldn't have had to go to Kassel, for example, to watch it. Couldn't we have organized this on a local level? Yeah, I understand. Because it could have been celebrated on a local level in different ways, etc. So I do think that there is a great need for interpretation. So that's what you're doing. That's great. You're interpreting it. The concept as such makes sense, but maybe it would have made sense to implement it on a more local level. I would have loved to read that about it. You know, not just saying, okay, it wasn't good, done, but I think it was difficult, and also due to the short notice, it was difficult for some people to understand that in your own role you have to sort of do a switch. The first days I went around like a normal visitor, you know, okay, you watch a piece of art, and then the second day you start realizing that you're a part of the whole project. You can actually change your role, and all of a sudden you are in a very different situation. And that's when you start to experience the things in a different way. Unfortunately, most people only go there for a day. They simply cannot afford to spend a week there. And that might also be a bit of a problem when it comes to organizing these events, that they were maybe communicated in the wrong way. You know, talking about the role expectations of the audience, of the visitors. What do the visitors have to do in order to really enjoy the event? But once you were there and you realized it, then this change of roles was really tangible. That it was really about a new understanding of art, of exhibitions, and that it's really about changing, jumping from one paradigm to the next. And that was really the opportunity. But yes, it was a shame that by those who were in charge, that wasn't really communicated, or at least not sufficiently. And this container, or the term Documenta, is so full of content that the expectations are simply huge. And to understand what the context is, where the Documenta takes place, that's really important. And I think it wouldn't have been a problem, really, the exhibition situation, you know, if it wouldn't have been this loaded sort of issue, Documenta.
Now, I must now start to provide a conclusion, a summary, and I have now got a very astounding result from the panel. I don't know whether I want to call it a result, but anyway, there is no interest whatsoever in art criticism as a judgment, but there is a lot of interest in art criticism, which is not necessarily criticism, but which has a lot of expertise in terms of explanation, and where does this come from, where does it go to? So this is being categorized or contextualized in discourses. That's very interesting, very exciting, because it's in line with my practice. I don't know, I'm a journalist in a way. And so I always want to explain things, to put things across to my readers. And now actually we can also relate this to what the initial speaker said. We need to know in which world we live and in which world art criticism is taking place. And this may also be a very important duty of criticism to explain this. And there is no fear that these perspectives, this has been fragmented here. Yeah, well, we are not really three professional art critics. Yeah, I'm fully relaxed. So my time is up now. So it's been very quick. We are back to zero, and I would like to thank you very much indeed. And this has been another very important, very interesting start of a conference where we will be having many more interesting discussions. Thanks a lot.